Before the modern era of gender-affirming care, similar clinics flourished in the 1970s under the leadership of Johns Hopkins. Today, we look at what brought them down. Welcome to the Carlat Psychiatry Podcast, keeping psychiatry honest since 2003.
I'm Chris Aiken, the editor-in-chief of the Carlat Psychiatry Report.
And I'm Kellie Newsome, a psychiatric NP and a dedicated reader of every issue. Let's start with a preview of the CME quiz. You'll find the full quiz in the show notes and the answer at the end of the podcast. Which medication reduced methamphetamine use in a large Phase 3 trial? A. Atomoxetine. B. Methylphenidate. C. Lithium. D. Mirtazapine.
Last week, we covered a controversial study that found little change in children's mental health after taking puberty-suppressing hormones for gender dysphoria. The author of this study worried that the results would be weaponized against patients, but as I read the study, I wondered what Dr. Olson Kennedy was afraid of. Negative studies are common in psychiatry, and one study is not going to rock the boat when there are dozens to pool together in a systematic review. And anyway, no one expects gender transition to cure all mental woes. Simply resolving the gender dysphoria ought to be enough. But I was wrong. Gender dysphoria isn't like other psychiatric conditions where we carefully weigh the accumulating evidence. This is a field where politics can overpower science, and a single study can bring the house down. That is what happened in 1979 when a paper appeared in the Archives of General Psychiatry titled Sex Reassignment, Follow-up.
To understand that paper, we need to go back to November 1966. In England, the Beatles began recording Sgt. Pepper, featuring a song about a woman named Rita who pays for her own dates and looks a little like a military man. In California, Ronald Reagan is elected governor, promising to restore law and order to the student protests at UC Berkeley. In China, the Red Army is rooting out class enemies of the Cultural Revolution, including gay and transgender people, whom they attack as bourgeois degenerates. And in Maryland, Johns Hopkins opens the first center for gender-affirming surgery in the U.S.
At the press conference inaugurating the opening, plastic surgeon John Hopps declared that psychiatrists had tried repeatedly to treat these people without surgery, and the conclusion is inescapable, that psychotherapy has so far not resolved the problem. Perhaps we should consider changing the body to fit the mind. Applications from prospective patients poured in, but the clinic was selective. Only about 3% of applicants were approved for surgery. Psychiatrists served as gatekeepers, and one psychiatrist was determined to lock those gates entirely.
In 1975, Paul McHugh moved to Johns Hopkins to chair the Department of Psychiatry. He came with the express purpose of bringing down the gender identity clinic, accusing them of cooperating with a mental illness. And in that effort, he found an unlikely ally, John Hoops, the same plastic surgeon who had opened the clinic a decade later. Hoops had grown disillusioned. He began describing patients as hysterical masochists and the surgery as an artificial facade. McHugh echoed that sentiment, writing that the surgery only turned them into caricatures of women, as if the true measure of success was whether these post-surgical patients conformed to the doctor's ideal of a woman. Together, McHugh and Hoops commissioned a study to prove the surgery didn't work.
The study compared patients who applied for surgery but were declined by the examining committee to those who received the operation. This is an unfair comparison, but one that likely is going to favor the patients who were deemed mentally healthy enough to go through the operation. But about half of the ones who were sent away by Johns Hopkins went on to have the surgery somewhere else, and that created a third group for additional comparison, as well as a testament to their determination. Now, this study was small, They followed 50 patients for 2 to 5 years. They started with 100, but there were a lot of dropouts. And they measured what the researchers considered markers of psychological adjustment: arrest records, employment history, how often they changed residences, psychiatric treatments, and whether they went on to marry a gender-appropriate partner. Yes, you heard that right. These were male patients who transitioned to female. And in the eyes of these researchers, they were healthy if they went on to marry a man after transitioning to a female. Back then, transition was viewed through a strict binary lens of male and female. No room for non-binary. And the drive to transition was seen as a kind of sexual fetish, rather than as an identity. Paul McHugh wrote in 2006 that there were only 2 kinds of transgender men. Some were, in his words, guilt-ridden homosexuals who thought they could have sex with men with a clear conscience if they became a woman. The rest, in McHugh's mind, were heterosexual men who saw themselves as lesbians and fantasized about having sex with a woman as a woman.
The researchers did not look at subjective outcomes like depression or anxiety. In their view, distress about gender was not the problem. It was their inability to conform to society's norms, and that is how they judged the success of surgery. If these measures seem archaic, the scoring system was more so. Patients lost the same number of points for going to jail as they did for starting outpatient psychotherapy.
This study is starting to make a really good case for having people with lived experience on research protocol panels. Anyway, here's what they found. At first glance, the surgery seemed to work. All groups improved with time, but the ones who transitioned saw greater improvements on this roughshod scale. But this didn't pass statistical tests. The confidence intervals were too wide in the group that transitioned, meaning the outcomes were all over the place, even if they looked good on average. So in the end, the only group with statistically significant improvements, that's the p-value, in adaptation were the ones who did not transition. Now, that's a lot of statistical talk there, but the bigger take-home point is that in this blur of data, it's impossible to draw any conclusion from a poorly controlled study with an unvalidated rating scale, a small sample size, and a 50% dropout rate.
But for the authors, the results were definitive. Dr. Meyer told the New York Times that surgery is not a proper treatment for a psychiatric disorder, and that transgender people have severe psychological problems that don't go away following surgery. Shortly after the study was completed, the Johns Hopkins board voted to ban gender-affirming surgery at the hospital in 1979. The building was demolished. In its place, Dr. McHugh oversaw construction of a psychiatry neurosciences tower. But as the walls were crumbling, something else was taking place in California that would build them back in a different form.
While Johns Hopkins was closing its clinic, delegates were gathering in San Diego for the 6th International Gender Dysphoria Symposium. There, they ratified the first formal guidelines on gender-affirming care, what we now know as the WPATH guidelines.
WPATH worked with the DSM committee to introduce a new diagnosis for the 1980 edition, gender identity disorder, hoping that this formal diagnosis would improve access to treatment. In 2013, the DSM committee changed name to gender dysphoria, making it one of the only entries in the DSM without the word disorder in the title. This was a radical idea, that the problem was not in the person's identity, but in the distress they felt by being in the wrong body. From that viewpoint, the goal is not to change the mind, but the body. Psychotherapy is not necessary. And that is how the WPATH guidelines stand today. They no longer require psychotherapy before transitioning.
This isn't just a philosophical position, it is grounded in evidence, though the evidence is not robust. Psychotherapy may reduce associated symptoms of gender dysphoria, like depression and anxiety. The results are mixed here, and the studies are few. But the bigger point is that psychotherapy doesn't change the person's identity. And some studies point to worse outcomes when patients are encouraged to accept their assigned gender.
I lived 20 plus years in a home and within a family that not only did not affirm me, but I knew that I was the last thing from safe to come out to. And after several rounds of conversion therapy and several years of a lot of that, I was kicked out. Without access to gender affirming care, without a community who affirms me, I don't think I would still be alive. I felt like at multiple times within those 20 years that I could not go on anymore. And I did attempt to take my own life.
That was Lindsay Spiro, who transitioned from female to male after a failed attempt at conversion therapy in their youth. Next week, we'll take a closer look at the science of gender identity and what the current WPATH guidelines say about assessing patients before transition. For now, a research update.
Today's study is the first large Phase 3 trial of mirtazapine in methamphetamine use disorder. 2 earlier trials were small and focused exclusively on men who have sex with men. That's a shift. Usually we have to wait to see data in underrepresented groups. This time, it's the other way around. The study was published by Rebecca McKetton and colleagues in JAMA Psychiatry, funded by the Australian government, whose country has the highest per capita methamphetamine use in the world. The U.S. follows closely, with particularly high rates in West Virginia, the Appalachians, and the Sunbelt states.
339 Australian adults with methamphetamine use disorder were randomized to mirtazapine 30 milligrams daily or placebo for 3 months. The results favored mirtazapine. The patients on mirtazapine saw a reduction in their meth use by 7 out of 28 days, as opposed to 5 out of 28 days reduction for those on placebo. Now, that's a modest but still a meaningful difference for a population with so few treatment options. The benefit was independent of mirtazapine's antidepressant or sedating effects. So how does it work? Likely it eases withdrawal symptoms and modulates reward pathways through dopamine. What are the risks? Weight gain, 10% of patients in this trial, and sedation. And I apologize, if you tried to go to my research update page in the past, the link was broken. It is fixed now. You can find all research updates at chrisaikenmd.com. Let me see, I'll test it right now. You click on Learn and Research Blog, and you're there, and you can also search all 200 by just the top practice-changing ones.
If you like this podcast, leave us a review in the Apple Store or subscribe online with a promo code PODCAST to get $30 off your first year's subscription and help us stay among the small number of publications like Current Affairs, New Philosopher, and Practical Farm Ideas that operate without commercial support.